Caleb Mercer was on his knees in the yard before sunrise, braiding his 9-year-old niece's hair in the dark because there was no one else to do it. Inside, the biscuits were burning. Eli, 6 years old, was crying over a boot he couldn't tie. The ranch hands were waiting at the fence, and Caleb was trying to be a father, a mother, a cook, and a foreman all at once, before the sun had even cleared the mountains. His brother Thomas and Thomas's wife had died 18 months earlier. A flooded river crossing. No warning. These were their children. He was all they had. That same morning, on the other side of the fence, a woman pulled up to the empty Greer cabin with one trunk and a government ledger. Hazel Brooks had been moving since her husband died 2 years ago. 4 towns, 4 borrowed rooms, never staying long enough to belong anywhere. She carried one thing through every move that she refused to leave behind: a coffee pot. That first morning, she set 2 cups on the table without thinking, poured into both, sat down across from the one that would go cold. 2 years, and her hands still hadn't learned to make just one. 2 broken people, one fence between them, because some open gates aren't left open by accident. The Greer cabin was empty, loaned to county workers passing through, and she had it swept and her trunk unpacked before the light changed. The broken shutter on the west window she fixed before dark using a hinge from the small toolbox under the washstand, because broken things bothered her, and she had stopped waiting for someone else to fix them a long time ago. She was 31 years old, a census recorder now, which was a respectable way of saying she went where the work sent her and stayed until it was done, and then moved on before any place had the chance to become anything she'd have to grieve leaving. Tuesday morning, she knocked on the Mercer door with a ledger under her arm. The man who opened it had flour on his hands and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been managing too many things since before the sun. Behind him, a pot had begun to smell of something that used to be biscuits, and from the back of the house came a small girl's voice, the same girl from the yard saying her boot wouldn't tie. "I'm Hazel Brooks," she said. "County Census." Caleb Mercer stepped back and let her in. His name was Caleb Mercer, 41, rancher. The house was clean the way houses are clean when someone works hard to keep them that way. Not naturally, but deliberately, the kind of clean that costs something. She asked her questions. Name, age, occupation, property. He answered in the fewest words available, which was the custom of men who had learned that words required energy, and energy was something you measured carefully. Household members? 2 children, my niece and nephew. He paused just slightly. Their parents are gone. She wrote it without looking up, because some answers deserved that. She was nearly done when the girl appeared in the kitchen doorway, ribbon in hand, braid already coming loose at one side. She was 9 years old, and had the watchful stillness of a child who had learned early that paying attention was its own kind of power. "This came out," she said. Hazel closed her ledger. "May I?" The girl looked at her for a moment with those careful eyes, then crossed the kitchen and stood with her back to Hazel. Hazel gathered the loose hair, found the part, began the braid with the unthinking ease of hands that had done it 1,000 times before, in a different kitchen, for a different reason. She was halfway through when the boy appeared from the back room. 6 years old, dark-eyed, with the serious face of a child who read rooms before he entered them. He walked to the table and stopped. He looked at Hazel for a long moment. "My mama's hair was your color," he said. "Brown like that." Everything went still. Caleb at the stove did not turn around, but his shoulders changed. "She used to let me hold the ribbon," the boy said, "when she did her braid." Hazel's hands did not stop moving, because stopping would have made it bigger than a child needed it to be. She finished the braid, tied the ribbon, and stood. "She must have loved that," she said. The boy nodded once. Small, Jossie the girl touched the back of her head, and then looked at Hazel with an expression that was assessment and something else, something that had not quite decided what it was yet. Caleb walked Hazel to the door. She thanked him for his time. He nodded. She made it to the fence line before the tears came. 30 seconds, no more. She pressed one hand against the fence post and let them come, and then she wiped her face with her heel and opened her ledger to the next property and went back to work. There were still names to be counted. 2 days after the census visit, Hazel saw Eli's mittens drying on the porch rail. The thumb had worn through to nothing. Jossie's coat, hung by the door, had a shoulder seam mended so many times the mend itself was fraying. She said nothing about it to anyone. That night, she took out the blue wool shawl she'd carried across 4 moves. It had once belonged to Daniel's mother, given to Hazel the winter they were first married, faded now at the edges, and she pulled several careful lengths of matching thread from one loose corner. Not enough to ruin it, enough to matter. She worked for 2 hours by lamplight. The stitches were small and exact. She reinforced the torn thumb, strengthened the seams, lined the inside where the wool had gone thin. The mittens still looked old when she finished. They would survive another Montana winter. Before dawn the next morning, she walked to the Mercer porch and left them folded on the step with a length of twine around them and no note. She was back at her own stove before the Mercer chimney had started to smoke. Caleb found them. He turned them over in his hands for a long time. The stitching was patient, careful not trying to hide the repairs, trying to make them last. He looked at the empty road and said nothing. 3 days later, Hazel came home to find the lean-to post outside the Greer cabin straightened and restaked, the latch on the gate repaired, the broken step braced with fresh-cut pine. Tucked under the new latch was a short piece of blue wool thread, the same color as her shawl. She stood at the gate and smiled at nobody. Neither of them said a word about any of it. Some kindnesses speak loudest when they go unacknowledged. It was Jossie who told her about the tree. Friday evening, walking the fence line home, Hazel paused at an old stump near the Mercer yard, silver with age, wide, half its roots pulling from the ground, something that had once been substantial. Jossie was on the porch with a book she wasn't reading. "Grandfather's," she said. "He planted every apple tree on this property. Lightning took that one the same summer our father died." She looked at the stump, the way she looked at things with history in them. Uncle Caleb said he'd replace it. "Some things you mean to get to," Hazel said, "and the getting to becomes its own kind of grief." Jossie looked at her with new attention. Hazel touched the old wood once and went home. She did not think about the stump on purpose. It stayed with her anyway, the way an unfinished thing stays quietly, without asking permission. The following Sunday, a hard rain came in and did not stop. Hazel crossed the fence with her coffee pot because she had made too much, and the Mercer kitchen was warm, and she did not examine her reasons more carefully than that. Caleb let her in. Eli was at the table with a piece of charcoal drawing something complicated. Jossie sat across from him with her primer. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a house that has people living in it. Hazel set 2 cups on the table, poured, and sat down. Caleb took the chair at the head of the table and looked at the cup in front of him. "I don't drink coffee," he said. She looked at him. "At all?" "No." She studied this as if he had said something that genuinely required working out. "Then how does your morning begin?" The corner of his mouth moved, almost. "Sun comes up." Hazel set her cup down with the seriousness of a woman stating a position she had held for years. "If I did not have my coffee, I would not get out of that bed if the sun itself came and sat down at my table and introduced itself by name." Eli looked up from his drawing. He looked at Hazel, then at his uncle, then back at his drawing. He was smiling at the paper. Jossie pressed her lips together and studied the ceiling. Caleb picked up the cup, drank. His expression did something it clearly had not planned to do. "Bitter," he said. "That means it's real." He looked at her across the table. She looked back with the straightforward gaze of a woman who meant exactly what she said. "Same time tomorrow?" he said. He had not meant to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do. "I'll bring the coffee," Hazel said. "You've done enough for one morning." Outside, the rain came down on the Montana spring, and in the Mercer kitchen something had quietly moved into a chair and did not look like it intended to leave. "Friends." If this story is already settling somewhere warm in your chest, are you a coffee person? Or do you agree with Caleb that the sun alone is sufficient? Let me know in the comments. Now let's go back to Montana. It was not all quiet mornings and coffee. The week after the rain, a section of the north fence came down in the night. A steer leaned through a rotted post and simply walked, and by sunrise 3 cattle were scattered into a neighbor's wheat, and Caleb spent the better part of a day on horseback getting them out, while Jossie kept the stove and minded Eli and a pot of beans that, by noon, had gone forgotten and scorched black on the bottom. He came in at dusk, filthy, and carrying the particular quiet of a man furious with himself, and found Hazel at the stove instead, a fresh pot started, the scorched one already scrubbed and put away. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I didn't do it for you," she said, which was not quite true, and they both knew it. "I did it because Jossie was trying to fix a meal that couldn't be fixed, and 9 years old is too young to carry that alone." Caleb looked toward the back room. Jossie sat at the table with the braced expression of a child, waiting to be told she had failed at something. He crossed to her, crouched to her level. "You kept the fire going, and kept your brother fed, and didn't lose him once in a day I wasn't here," he said. "Burned beans is the least important thing that happened today." Jossie's shoulders came down, just slightly, which for Jossie was the equivalent of tears. Hazel turned back to the stove, and did not say anything because some moments belonged only to the people inside them. It was Pearl Olafson who said it first, at the Mercantile that same week, while Hazel was waiting on flour. "Those Mercer children," Pearl said, not unkindly folding her receipt, "look better than they have since the accident." She glanced at Hazel with the particular look of a woman who has already connected the pieces and is only saying the polite version of what she knows. "Whatever's happening over at that ranch, it's doing them good." Hazel said, "Thank you," and did not elaborate, but she walked home a little slower than usual, thinking about it. The children chose her the way children choose things. Jossie began appearing in the kitchen whenever Hazel was there, working beside her with the quiet competence of a girl who had decided that being useful was the safest way to stay close to someone she was afraid to lose. She learned to fold towels the way Hazel folded them corners matched, edges straight without ever being shown, only by watching. Eli saved her a seat, not always the same chair, but always a specific one moved slightly from the table at an angle that made room before she arrived. One afternoon at the Mercer Ranch, Hazel found Eli in the yard with a length of Jossie's ribbon, attempting to braid it around his own wrist and failing. She sat down across from him. "Can I show you something?" He pushed the ribbon toward her. She took his small hand and laid the ribbon across it, and began to walk him through the beginning of a simple braid. He watched with the focused attention he brought to everything he wanted to understand. When it was done, he looked at his wrist for a long time. "Mama did it faster," he said. "She had more practice." "Will I get faster?" "If you practice." He looked at the braid. "Okay," he said, as though he had made a decision. Caleb had turned from the window without realizing it. He stood looking at the table, at Eli's wrist, at Hazel's hands guiding the ribbon, at his nephew's face, wearing an expression of focused peace he hadn't seen there in 18 months. Something shifted in his chest that he did not have a name for yet. He looked away before she could see his face. He had no business feeling whatever that was. But he stood at the window a long time after, not reading his land records. Jossie in the doorway saw. The evening the second cup came up. Caleb was out late helping a neighboring rancher with a fence line. Hazel was at the stove with the children when she reached, without thinking, for 2 cups, poured into both, set them on the table. Only then did she look at what she'd done. She picked up the second cup to put it back. Eli frowned. "Why'd you make 2? "Habit," she said. He thought about this. Did somebody forget to come? Jossie looked up from the biscuit dough she was working. Hazel set the cup down and lowered herself into her chair. "I used to make 2 every morning," she said. Eli looked at the cup. "For who?" "My husband." "The one who went to heaven?" Jossie asked. "Yes." Hazel looked at the steam rising from the cup. He said coffee was never meant for one person. Every morning, Every evening, after church, after a hard day, he always waited until I sat down. He wouldn't drink his until I had mine. Eli was very still. When he died, Hazel said, my brother-in-law packed away the coffee pot, said there was no use keeping what was made for two when there was only one left. Her hands tightened around her own cup. I bought a new one the same afternoon. Because he was right. Coffee isn't meant for one person. The only way I knew to argue with my grief was to keep making 2 cups anyway. The kitchen was quiet. For how long? Eli asked. I don't rightly know. He looked at the cup between them. Then he picked it up with both hands and slid it across the table until it sat beside her. Not anymore, he said. Jossie got up without a word and came around the table and put her arms around Hazel's shoulders. Hazel gathered them both against her and held on. That was how Caleb found them when he came in 3 people in the lamplight, the table set for 4, 2 cups where there had always been one. He understood. He took the second cup from where Eli had left it and crossed to the stove and poured it full and sat back down and drank it and did not say anything about it, which was the truest thing he had done in a long time. A barn cat had kittens in the hayloft the 3rd week of May, and Eli found the smallest one and hid it inside his coat for 2 full days before anyone noticed. By the time Hazel discovered it tucked inside his jacket at the supper table, eyes still closed, small enough to fit in one palm, he had already named it, fed it scraps from his own plate for 48 hours, and prepared a defense that covered feeding schedule, sleeping arrangements, and what he considered the ethical obligations of finding something that needed you. Hazel listened to the full argument without interrupting. Then she negotiated the kitten lived in the barn. Eli visited twice daily. Eli accepted this with the expression of a child who knows he got a fair deal. You'd make a decent circuit judge, Caleb said from the doorway. I've had practice, she said. He almost smiled, which was different from smiling, but in the same family. Franklin Carter introduced himself to Hazel at the dry goods counter on a Wednesday with the pleasant confidence of a man who had decided something and was going about it honestly. He was the new school teacher for the settlement east of town, 38 years old, easy to talk to, the kind of man who listened before he spoke. He asked if she would ride to the Pine Creek Social on Saturday. No pressure, he said, only 2 people sharing an evening. Hazel thanked him and said she'd think on it. That evening, Eli arrived at her cabin carrying a basket of eggs from Caleb's hens, Jossie beside him, and neither child said anything about Franklin until they were nearly home, when Eli stopped in the middle of the trail and turned around. Are you going somewhere Saturday? He asked. I haven't decided, she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he was turning something over. The next morning, 2 cups were already on the Mercer table when she arrived, poured and steaming, and Caleb was at the window with his land records, and did not look up. Coffee's ready, he said. She sat down. She did not go to the Pine Creek Social. Franklin was a decent man and she wished him well, and that was the end of it. Market day came clear and warm, and Hazel walked the stalls with Jossie beside her, and Eli half a step behind, carrying the basket with the seriousness of a boy who had been given a job. At the far end of the market, a traveling nursery had set up under canvas. Rows of young trees in wooden tubs, cherry, pear, plum, apple. Hazel slowed without planning to. She moved between the rows, running her fingertips across small leaves. The smell of fresh earth rose from the pots. An elderly nurseryman smiled at her. Looking for shade or fruit? Only looking, Hazel said. That's how most purchases begin. Jossie moved carefully through the trees. They're babies. They are. Do apples really grow on these? One day. Jossie frowned. That's forever. To children, maybe. One sapling at the end of the row caught Hazel's eye. Not the tallest, not the prettiest. Its trunk leaned slightly, and one branch had broken once and healed crooked. She rested her hand against the thin trunk. That one's tougher than it looks, the nurseryman said. It survived something, she said. So did you, I'd wager. She looked at him. He offered nothing but the observation, Jossie came and stood beside her. She looked at the sapling, then at the old stump behind the Mercer fence, which was not visible from here, but which Jossie was clearly seeing anyway. "You could plant it where grandfather's was," she said. Hazel opened her mouth. What she had been about to say was that she would not be here long enough for that to mean anything. She looked at the tree. She thought about a tree she and Daniel had never planted. A plan that became a wound that became 2 years of moving from place to place, because a thing you never let yourself want cannot be lost. She looked at the sapling. "I'll take it," she said. Jossie's face did something it rarely did. They planted it that afternoon, at the old stump, where grandfather's wealthy had stood for decades before the lightning took it. Caleb widened the hole after the children wandered off to argue over worms. Jossie poured the first water, and most of it went on her boots, and she giggled in a way Hazel had not heard from her before, a real child sound unguarded. Eli stood back with his hands on his hips, assessing. "It looks small," he said. "It won't stay small," Caleb said. When the planting was done and the stakes were level, they stood together looking at it in the evening light. The sapling was bare and thin and entirely committed to its new ground. Jossie looked at it a long time, then at Hazel. "You'll be gone before it blooms," she said. The honesty of a child who has learned that hoping too loudly makes the loss louder too. Hazel looked at the tree. She didn't have an answer for that yet. She touched the thin trunk once, lightly, the way you touch something you were trusting to grow without you, and said nothing. The frost came that same night without warning, the kind that kills new roots before they can hold. Hazel woke to the cold smell of it and ran. She was already across the fence with burlap sacking in her arms when she saw the lantern. Caleb was crouched at the base of the sapling in the dark, packing straw around the roots with his bare hands. He looked up when he heard her coming. He had thought of it too, had come out alone, not knowing she would come. They worked without speaking. She wrapped the trunk, he banked the base, and the whole thing took less than 10 minutes. When it was done, they stood in the frozen dark, looking at the small wrapped tree they had just fought for together. Neither of them said what they both understood, that you don't run across a fence in the middle of the night for a tree. She did not come the next morning. Caleb noticed at 6, when the coffee was ready, and the chair across from him was empty. He noticed again at 7, when Eli set her cup out of habit, and then looked at the door. By 8 he put his hat on and walked across the fence. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. "I'm all right," she said, from somewhere inside that did not sound all right. He let himself in. She was in the chair by the stove, wrapped in her quilt, the kind of pail that comes from a night of cold ground and wet feet, and not enough sleep. The kettle was cold. She had not managed to light the stove. He lit it without comment, went back to the ranch, told Jossie to watch Eli, and returned 20 minutes later with a pot of broth that Jossie had helped him heat, because he had stood in front of the stove looking at it for a full minute before admitting he was not sure. He set it on the table beside her. She looked at the pot, then at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He pulled the other chair close and sat down. "I know," he said. She smiled into the quilt. They sat in the quiet of the small cabin while the stove warmed the room, and after a while she said, without planning to the way you say things when your guard is down and someone is simply there, "My husband and I were going to plant an apple tree, the spring we married." She looked at the window. "We never did. There was always a reason to wait." Her hands tightened around the cup he had put in them. "I think I have been planting it ever since. Every place I stopped, looking for the right ground." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Did you find it?" he asked. She looked at him. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. He came back that evening with bread he had made, and the morning after, when she was well enough to cross the fence herself, he had already poured her coffee before she knocked. After the tree was planted, something in Caleb changed the way rivers change course. He drank his coffee now, every morning, without remark, as if he had always done so. Hazel noticed the morning she arrived and found a basket of early vegetables on her porch step, carrots, onions, a bundle of fresh-cut sage. No note. She looked toward the ranch where the chimney had already started to smoke. He left firewood stacked to the roof of her lean-to 2 days later, every piece split even. Neither of them mentioned any of it out loud, because they had been speaking this language for weeks now, and it required no translation. One evening Hazel came home from a long day of census, riding to find Jossie and Eli on her porch. "Uncle Caleb said you'd be tired," Eli said. "He walked us over so you wouldn't have to eat alone," Jossie said. Caleb stood a step behind them with his hat in his hands. "I hope we're not imposing." "You're not," Hazel said, which they all understood was the least true sentence she had spoken in weeks. They ate supper at her table, and Eli talked about the kitten, and Jossie practiced reading aloud from Hazel's worn geography book. And when they left, Hazel stood in the doorway and watched them cross the field, Caleb's hand on Eli's shoulder, Jossie carrying the lamp, and felt something in her chest. She had been careful not to name for a long time. She named it that night, and then she sat very still with it, because it was the most frightening thing she had felt in 2 years, and also the most like being alive. The county supervisor arrived on a Wednesday. He reviewed her completed ledgers with the efficient approval of a man who had seen enough careless work to appreciate the careful kind. 3 ranches remain, he said. Finish by Friday. Wagon comes the Saturday after next. He rode out. Hazel sat at the table after he was gone and looked at the apple tree through the window. Saturday. That evening she walked to the Mercer fence and stood there, and Caleb came out of the barn and stood on the other side, and neither of them said the word Saturday out loud, which meant it was the only word in the air between them. "Heard the job's nearly done," he said. "Friday," she said. He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man who had been bracing for something long enough that the bracing had become its own kind of exhaustion. "County might need recorders again," he said. "Come spring." She looked at him. "Is that what you came out here to say?" He met her eyes, then looked toward the sapling, small and pale in the evening light. "Eli will miss having someone to practice the braid with," he said. "Eli," she said, both of them knowing it wasn't about Eli. He nodded once and went back inside. Inside, he stood in the kitchen in the dark without lighting the lamp. He had stood at that fence with every intention of saying the true thing, and had said the small thing instead, and he knew the difference, and could not explain to himself why he had done it, except that saying the true thing meant she could still say no, and he had not yet decided which was worse, not asking, or asking and hearing the answer he was afraid of. He lit the lamp. He put the kettle on. He sat down at the table where her cup still sat from that morning, cold and untouched, and looked at it for a long time. Margaret Calloway arrived the following Thursday. She was Lucy's mother, Eli, and Jossie's grandmother, 62 years old, sharp and upright, and married to a man with enough money to give her opinions the particular confidence that comes when the world has generally agreed with you. She had grieved her daughter genuinely for 3 months, and then begun, quietly and methodically, to grieve the question of what would become of Lucy's children, which was a grief she found easier to act on. She had been watching the Mercer Ranch. She had heard, as everyone in the valley had heard, about the census widow who came every morning, who the children had attached themselves to, who was at the Mercer table more evenings than not. She had heard at the dry goods store that Hazel's census work was nearly done, and she had, without telling anyone, written to the county seat to inquire about the legal standing of a maternal grandmother in matters of guardianship, should such a matter ever come before a judge. The letter was still in her drawer. She had not sent it yet. She was waiting to decide if she needed to. She came to the church supper on a Friday evening. Hazel came with an apple cake, sat beside Jossie, and was halfway through a quiet conversation with Eli about whether the tree needed more water when she became aware of someone watching her from the far side of the room. Margaret came to the table midway through the meal, while Caleb was up getting coffee. She sat down across from Hazel with the posture of a woman who had decided something. "You seem like a decent woman," she said, which was not a compliment. Hazel looked at her. "But decent women understand," Margaret continued, with the particular quiet of someone who has rehearsed, "that a man in Caleb's position, a widower, raising 2 children alone, with no formal arrangement in place, is in a vulnerable situation, and that people will draw conclusions about a household that cannot explain itself. Eli had gone very still. Jossie set her fork down. I have my daughter's grandchildren to think about, Margaret said. Their stability, their reputation, their future. I think you understand what I mean. Hazel looked at her steadily, hands in her lap. If you have concerns about this household, she said, you should speak to Caleb. He is the one who makes decisions here. I am speaking to you, Margaret said, because women sometimes understand things more plainly when they hear them from another woman. You are not from here. You have no roots here. You have an assignment that ends in 2 days. What you are doing with this looks like is not nothing, and Lucy's children deserve better than a situation that looks like nothing. The table nearby had gone quiet. Jossie's hands were folded in her lap very tight. Eli was looking at the tablecloth, and then Jossie stood up. She was 9 years old, and she stood with the particular stillness of a child who has decided something and is not going to be moved from it. And she looked at her grandmother with eyes that were her mother's eyes, and she said, She fixed Eli's mittens when they wore through. She braided my hair every morning for 2 weeks without being asked. She planted a tree next to grandfather's stump because Uncle Caleb hadn't been able to yet. She sat with me when I couldn't sleep. Her voice was even. She didn't do any of that for nothing. The hall was quiet. Margaret looked at her granddaughter. Caleb returned from the coffee table, took in the scene in a single look, and sat down. He looked at Margaret with the steadiness of a man who has decided something. You want to know the shape of this household, he said. Here it is. Those are my children in every way that matters, and I will raise them in a house with people in it who choose to be there. If that's not enough for a judge, then that's a conversation I'm prepared to have, but I won't have it at a supper table in front of them. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. I'm not your enemy, Caleb, she said, quieter. I know that, he said, but you came at Hazel like one tonight, in front of the children, and that I won't forget easily. She left before dessert. Crisanto, her husband, followed her without having said a word, which was his custom. The table was quiet for a moment, then Eli reached across and took Hazel's hand, not dramatically, just placed his and hers the way you place something you want her to keep, and went back to his cake. Margaret did not send the letter. She came to Hazel's cabin the following morning, alone, while the children were at the ranch with Caleb, and stood at the door with the expression of a woman who was not going to apologize exactly, but was going to say the closest thing to it that she knew how. I buried my daughter 18 months ago, she said, and I have not been afraid of anything smaller than losing what's left of her ever since. She held Hazel's gaze. I am not a villain, but last night I acted like one to protect something I could have simply asked you about. Hazel made room in the doorway. She put the kettle on, set 2 cups on the table. They sat for an hour. Margaret asked about Daniel. Hazel asked about Lucy. 2 women with their hands around cups, talking about the people they were still learning to live without. When Margaret left, the letter stayed in her drawer. She came to supper the following Sunday, and let Eli show her his braiding practice without comment, and that was the beginning of a different kind of peace. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Hazel's trunk sat in the middle of the cabin floor. Not packed yet, but present. She had moved it from the wall the night before, and had not moved it back. She filled the kettle, reached for 2 cups, poured both. She sat with them for a long time. Then she carried 1 cup to the fence and set it on the post. The apple tree stood in the early morning, new leaves small and green, steady. Caleb came out of the barn and saw the cup on the post and crossed to the fence slowly. She was looking at the tree, not at him, and he stood there understanding with a clarity that had arrived too late that he had spent 18 months learning to hold things together alone, and somewhere in the last 6 weeks had forgotten how to imagine doing it that way again. He had said the wrong thing at every fence, every doorway, every moment that asked for the true sentence. He was still holding the cup. The wagon would come at 9. The cabin door burst open. Eli came across the yard at a dead run with his coat sideways and his laces trailing, and the urgency of a child who has woken to something he absolutely cannot allow to happen. He stopped at the fence, breathing hard, and pulled something from his coat pocket. A small wooden apple. Rough, uneven, carved from a piece of fence wood. He held it out to her with both hands. "I made it," he said, "for when you can't see the real one." Hazel looked at the carving, at his serious, earnest face. Her breath caught. He pushed it a little closer. "Please," he said, "don't make him eat alone again." The yard went still. Jossie had come out onto the porch. She stood with her arms at her sides. Caleb stood at the fence with a cup in his hand. He looked at Eli, then at Hazel. He set the cup down on the post between them. "You'll be gone by spring," he said. The words he had carried for weeks, said now not as a fact, but as the last thing standing between him and the harder sentence. Hazel looked at the tree, at the small carving in her hands, at the cup on the fence post. She smiled. "Then why did I plant an apple tree?" The yard held that. Jossie sat down on the porch step, slowly, as if her legs had decided for her. Eli looked from Hazel to his uncle with the expression of a boy waiting to see if the adults were finally going to do the obvious thing. Caleb looked at Hazel for a long moment. "Spring's a long way off," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Cabin's empty until then, and after." She looked at him, at the children, at the tree with its roots already deeper than they looked. She set her bag down on the Mercer side of the fence. The wagon came at 9. It rolled past the end of the lane without stopping. The letter Margaret had written to the county seat she burned in her kitchen fireplace that afternoon, and she came to supper the following week, and the week after that, and eventually the Sundays at the Mercer Ranch became simply the way Sundays were. The ceremony was small. The minister, 2 witnesses, an apple cake Hazel made herself. Jossie signed as a witness in careful, deliberate letters. Eli wore a collar he kept straightening and finally gave up on. When they came out of the chapel into the afternoon sun, Eli took Caleb's hand, and Caleb looked down at the small hand in his, and did not trust himself to speak. And Hazel, watching from his other side, saw his face in that moment, and understood that this was the thing he had needed most and not known how to ask for. 7 years later, the apple tree was taller than the porch roof. Eli, 13 now, climbed it the way he had been climbing it since he was 8, with more confidence than caution, which had not changed. Jossie stood below with her arms crossed, which also had not changed. The first apple had come in the tree's 4th year. Hazel had brought it inside and set it on the table, and nobody ate it, until Caleb cut it into 4 pieces and handed them around without ceremony, the way he did everything that mattered. This year the branches were heavy. Hazel made the first pie of the season on a Saturday morning with the kitchen door open and the smell of cinnamon reaching all the way to the barn where Caleb was working. He came in before she called him, the way he always did when something good was happening in the house, not because she asked, but because he had learned, 7 years ago, that a home with Hazel in it was worth walking toward. He sat down at the table. 4 cups, a pie cooling on the sill, an apple tree outside the window, finally bearing everything it had always promised, and on the table between the sugar bowl and the coffee pot, still sitting where Hazel had placed it the morning the wagon passed, without stopping, a small, rough wooden apple, cracked along one side, that nobody had ever moved, because some things earn their place not by being beautiful, but by meaning more than anything beautiful could.